Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, September 4th, 2014. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, will using Clarity Ferm in your beer result in significantly reduced gluten? Is this the answer for celiacs looking to drink good beer again? Dr. Chris Hamilton of Hillsdale College in Michigan shares his data from 3 different beer styles, including American wheat. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. You can find me on Twitter. I'm Basic Brewing, all one word. On Facebook, I'm at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. Our show page on Facebook, which is probably where you should go for Facebook-related stuff, is at facebook.com/basicbrewing. We're on the Google Plus as well. And thanks to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. This is important. Whenever you think of Amazon shopping, go to our website first, basicbrewing.com. Click on our Amazon ad on the right-hand side of the page. That will take you back to Amazon. You won't notice any difference, but you'll be helping to support this show. We greatly appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site as well that work in this similar fashion. You can find our Basic Brewing iPhone app on iTunes, our Android app on Amazon.com. We've also got a Windows app. We're on the BlackBerry podcast directory, Stitcher. We're just everywhere. Check out our Brewer's Logbook at basicbrewingshop.com. In the front is a blank calendar that you can use to track your fermentations and plan your brews. And there's room in the back to log the details of up to 50 batches of beer. If you want to put a tip in our tip jar, some coinage in our guitar case, so to speak, you can go to basicbrewing.com/support. Thanks to everybody who's done so already. Protect your precious beer with one of our growler bags. Check those out at basicbrewingshop.com. For a limited time, you can get a free Basic Brewing bottle opener with the purchase of any of our DVD combos. Quite a deal. That's a $10 value for free. There's a new episode of Basic Brewing Video out there on the feed. In this week's show, Steve and I taste the pale ale that I brewed in the 3-gallon plastic water cooler jug that I got at the hardware store. Will it brew good beer? Will there be any ill effects? Is it hard to clean out? Check it out and see. In all the rush and hurry in getting last week's show online, I forgot to mention a very important thing. I got an email from the American Homebrewers Association saying that the law that would allow homebrew events in California has been signed by the governor. So that opens the door for California homebrew festivals and for the National Homebrewers Conference in San Diego next year. So that's very, very good news. I want to move right along because there's a lot to get through this week. This is the final episode that I recorded up in Grand Rapids in June surrounding the Homebrew Conference. And I want to take this opportunity to challenge those of you who are going to San Diego next year. Can you come up with as many interesting and fun and useful experiments as all of those people? Now let's get on with it. Now that the gauntlet has been virtually thrown down, if you have celiac disease or you are gluten intolerant, this is an exciting show for you, or should be. We tasted 2 beers that Chris brewed up in Grand Rapids, a cream ale and a stout, and I've been delaying posting this episode because Chris Hamilton joined me this week via Skype to share the results from a 3rd beer. He tested an American wheat beer. So Chris did a write-up on all of this, which will run as a series this week on beerandwinejournal.com, by the way. So pop over there in the next couple of days for more details on that, beerandwinejournal.com. In the meantime, let's go back in time to June in Grand Rapids as we join Dr. Chris Hamilton of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan. Here we are back in the Grand Rapids headquarters of Basic Brewing Radio, and joining us is Chris Hamilton.
Hi, James.
And you are, what do you do and where do you do it?
I am a biochemistry professor at Hillsdale College, and of course an avid homebrewer.
That's good. And joining us also is Andy Sparks.
Great to be here.
And Mr. Steve Wilkes.
Hi, James.
Guess what, guys? We got more beer to taste.
Yay.
Another experiment. So this is awesome. I appreciate your coming to us with the experiment. And we are talking about gluten. And gluten is it's the thing. Everything is gluten-free or, advertised as gluten-free. What's all the hubbub about gluten?
Well, the hubbub is primarily about people with celiac disease, because one of the proteins in gluten called gliadin or gliadin, and they have a reaction to it. Once it goes into the small intestine, basically your immune system tries to attack it, and in the process it attacks your small intestine and starts to actually break it down. And so long term can cause serious issues like malnutrition and things like that. So for people that have celiac disease, anything that contains gluten or gluten-like proteins from barley or wheat or any of those types of grains gets really sick and pretty much can't have regular beer. And so the idea with the experiment, of course, is to try to make a barley beer that you can actually drink.
And this is a real thing. I mean, it's kind of a fad in foods nowadays, and there have been some videos on the internet of people who consider themselves to be gluten-free or to eat gluten-free foods, and you ask them what gluten is, and they don't know what it is. And so there are people who have chosen to be gluten-free that really, it shouldn't matter whether they're gluten-free or not, but there are some people that actually suffer from this.
Yeah, it's about 1% of the population. So certainly not as much as the fad would have you believe, but 1%, I mean, that's several million Americans.
Yeah, it's more than I thought. So describe the experiment.
So, experiment had a couple different experiments, but the essential, did you want me to talk about the cream ale experiment first or the stout one?
Sure. Go in whichever order.
Okay, chronologically.
It makes sense, yeah.
So one of the great things I get to do as being a home brewer and a biochemist is I get to do research, and so I can combine my interests together and get someone else to pay for some of it. And so in the first one, a student and I, Caitlin, brewed up a cream ale. And we picked a cream ale because we knew it would have a lower gluten concentration to begin with. It has corn and rice in it, which are gluten-free. And it was a partial mash recipe. And so the idea was to brew up a big, 5-gallon batch and split it into 5 1-gallon fermenters. And what we did is we had one, which is our control batch, which had no Clarity Ferm added, just a normal brew. And then the next one, our B sample, we added half a milliliter of the Clarity Ferm solution. And then we added 1 milliliter to the C sample, 2 to the D sample, and actually 5 to the E sample to see, does the concentration really matter? And what we found really is the amount of, the gliadin protein in there, it didn't really, and we know it works. We've done the lab analysis. There's an ELISA kit, which is an enzyme-linked assay that you can do in the lab, since I have access to that equipment. And the kits aren't cheap, but we can do that, and I can teach students about biochemistry while we're doing it. And so that's really fun, and the students get really excited about it. But the concern is that, what is this doing to the taste of the beer, the quality of the beer, the flavor, the mouthfeel? And so that's kind of what I find kind of really interesting. I can say the lab analysis shows the enzyme works. And if you use it at the concentrations that White Labs now says to use, you pitch one of these big vials in a 5-gallon batch. In most beers, it will take your beer down below the 20 parts per million, which is the current FDA recommendation to call something, gluten-free. But when we get to the regular concentrations, it's below 5 parts per million. So it's very low. Again, can you really say absolutely it's gluten-free? No, because there could be some very low levels. So what I would always tell anyone who's drinking that has celiac disease to start slow and see, because there are potentially people that could be really hypersensitive, where 1 part per billion could give them a reaction. I mean, there aren't that many people that sensitive, but I would always want people to know there's no detectable protein in there, but there could be trace levels or fragments of the gliadin part of gluten in there.
And you've had someone with celiac disease test these beers?
Yeah, she tried them, and she's tried a couple different ones. We had a pale ale before this, and she's tried the cream ale, and most recently the stout that we also brewed. And she hasn't had any issues with any of those beers. So again, one person is anecdotal. We've had other people that chose gluten-free diets that probably don't have celiac disease, but they've drank them as well, and they've of course been fine.
So I guess we should back up and talk about what Clarity Ferm is.
So Clarity Ferm, it's sold by White Labs, and what it really is, it's an enzyme from Aspergillus niger, which is black mold.
That makes it sound less appealing.
But the enzyme is a class called a prolyl endopeptidase. And a prolyl endopeptidase, prolyl is like proline, which is amino acid. And they're a very specific type of protease that can cleave proteins after these proline amino acids. And gluten, the gliadin part of it, is full of proline residues. And most proteases that we have in our digestive systems can't break down proteins after proline. So the normal pepsin that you have in your stomach, the trypsin, they can't cleave after proline residues. So they go through most people completely fine. It's just people that have celiac disease, these little peptides that come through that have all these prolines in them, they can actually undergo further modifications as well. But that's why they have the reaction. The idea is that the enzyme can break those small peptides down, and those proteins down even smaller, so now you have free amino acids or very small peptides that you shouldn't have a reaction to.
Huh, okay. Took me back to a high school chemistry class there. Just a minute. You did two phases. You did the cream ale,
right,
with higher concentrations of progressively higher concentrations of the Clarity Ferm.
Correct. And then the second experiment, we actually brewed a stout. It's a clone of a Sierra Nevada, and in that one, what we wanted to test was we knew what concentrations of Clarity Ferm should work. But we wanted to say, we're using darker grains. It's a different recipe, so we still need to do the analysis. But we also wanted to look at, what if we vary the mash process? The cream ale was done with the single infusion at about 150-ish. And so we did one of the stouts at about, I have to look back at the sheets, but I think it was about 153 or 154. But then we did one where we actually did 3 different mash temperatures. So we did a protein rest, I think it was about I'm trying to remember now, about 115, and then we raised it and did the 2 saccharification rests. So we did one in the low 140s and then one in the high 150s, with the idea that when you're doing that protease rest, you're going to be liberating more proteases, more protein matter into there. What is that going to do? Is that going to be a positive or a negative? We really didn't know. One of the thoughts was if Clarity Ferm, if the enzyme works, but it tends to make the beer have a lower mouth, or a thinner mouthfeel, that maybe liberating more protein would help with that. We didn't really know, and so that's why we wanted to do the experiment.
Should we talk about? I mean, the reason that we have our cups assembled is to do kind of a sensory analysis. Mm-hmm. Should we talk about the results beforehand? Go ahead and talk about the results from the lab data beforehand, and then go on to the tasting afterwards, or how do you suggest?
Well, which results do you want to talk about? The gluten analysis or our tasting?
Let's talk about the gluten analysis.
So the gluten analysis for the cream ale, what we found was that when we added the lowest concentration, so that was a 0.5 milliliter per gallon, which is less than the recommended dosage. What we found there is a significant reduction in the gliadin, the gluten levels in the beer. It was less than 20 parts per million, but it was probably, and it varied in several trials, but it was at least 5 parts per million. So it was definitely detectable. It was really there. Once we got up to to 1 mil and above, the numbers that we got were below the area where you could actually quantify it. So it's below the level of quantification. We would still get some numbers, and I showed you the bar graphs earlier. You can see there's a little bit of hovering. We did some tests, does carbonation matter and things like that. And, so there's a little bit of variability in any experiment, but really we found that it's really within the variability that you could not really, some of the tests showed up pretty much as 0, because below detectable. The other ones, it was like, yeah, there's maybe something there, but we can't quantify it. So it's definitely less than 5 parts per million. And so we found that with the cream ales. And then we knew that pretty much if we used it at those levels, it should be gluten-free. So we continued to use it at what the levels that White Lab now recommends, which they actually recommend 10 milliliters for a 5-gallon batch. So we did the fermentations with the stouts. We had to do 2 different batches because of different mash techniques. And we actually did those all in triplicates. So we actually brewed up 12 gallons of beer to do that. So we split things into, so we had 3 3-gallon fermenters at the control with the 1 mash technique, 3 3-gallon fermenters with the Clarity Ferm with the same mash technique, and then the other ones with the other mash technique. So, in my part of my lab was sequestered for food use, and so we had 12 gallons of beer fermenting at once. It was a lot of fun.
So what did you find out with the stout test?
So with the stout, the analysis that we did there, everything again showed up. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but everything was again below that 5 parts per million. And so using it at the recommended levels. And we're hoping to do an experiment. It's already in progress. Actually, with a wheat beer, and we do know from the analysis of that before adding Clarity Ferm, it's got much higher levels. And so that's going to be really interesting once we can look at that. And I'll be sure to send you the results later on.
Yeah. And we haven't talked about where the Clarity Ferm was added, I don't think.
So the recommended place to add Clarity Ferm is with the yeast. And so when you're pitching the yeast, we brew up the beer, chill the beer, and then as we're pitching the yeast, and we just actually put it right into the fermenter right after we add the yeast.
Seems easy enough. You guys have any questions before we go into the tasting?
I don't think so. I'm excited to see the results and taste the beers.
Are we ready to taste?
Sure, we can open up those bottles.
Okay, well, let's pause the recording, and we'll taste, and we will be back. Okay, we've sampled the cream ales. We've got 5 samples in front of us, a control, and then the progressive additions, or progressively higher additions of Clarity Ferm in the process. So we've noticed kind of a fairly apparent visual difference right off, didn't we, Steve?
Yeah, the Clarity Ferm seems to enhance head retention as far as my eyes are concerned. I'm not sure I see a lot of difference in color, although I wasn't looking very closely for that, so Andy might have a thought there.
At first, and I think it's just the way the light is on the table, I thought the one at the end, the one with the most Clarity Ferm, was lighter, but then as I picked up the one with the least amount of Clarity Ferm and the most, and I look at them together, and I don't really perceive much color difference in them.
But the ones, especially the last 3, had progressively more head production and then more head retention. They foamed up more when you poured them. You poured each beer the same, and then especially the one on the end held that big head for quite a long time. What were your impressions in tasting?
First, I want to say that the beer itself is really quite good. So I don't know what your recipe is, but it's a good one, and they're well brewed. So I can say that the difference between the control beer that has no Clarity Ferm and the 5th beer, which has the highest concentration, I feel like I can taste a difference in the beer. That the highest concentration has a softer mouthfeel, a little less viscous, but it's very slight. It's almost imperceptible. And I would say that if I hadn't had the control beer in front of me, I wouldn't have said that there was anything done to alter the beer.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like the ones that have the most Clarity Ferm tend to be a little bit drier. But the fact I actually perceived the one with the least amount of Clarity Ferm was maybe had a little better body than the first one. I'm not sure if that's reality or it's just my perception, but it seemed like it actually enhanced it a hair at first.
Yeah, I think even the one with the most Clarity Ferm to me was not watery. No. It was not unsatisfying. I thought it was just fine. I mean, the carbonation level was good, and maybe that's got something to do with it. But were there any of the differences that you detected in the flavor or aroma or anything like that?
I actually do think that the control beer has a little bit, just ever so slightly, a little bit crisper hop bite. It seems like it's just a little bit, that sharp bitterness is a little bit more pronounced than in any of the Clarity Ferm examples. So I don't know, let's pretend for a moment that that's true. So I don't know if that means you could add just ever so slightly more hops to reclaim that, if that's a true statement, or like Andy said, if it's just my perception.
Yeah, I mean, this is just another opportunity to prove I struggle with identifying subtle differences in beers. I find them all to be very, very close together. Yeah, I would not object to any of these beers. They all taste delicious.
So, Chris, what was your sensory data?
It was pretty much along similar lines. Most people that tried it could sense a little bit of a difference in the C. And the D and the E, they did feel the mouth feel. It wasn't necessarily, it was just slightly more watery. There weren't any consistent differences in the flavor, but people did have comments on the E, especially having just a slightly different flavor. Not a bad flavor, just slightly different. And again, when we had these, this was several months ago, so the beers have had time to age now too, and maybe that mellowing has taken care of some of that.
Now, which beer is dosed with the White Lab's recommended dose?
The current recommended dose, they currently sell a 10 ml vial, which they say is good for a 5 to 10 gallon batch. So if it's for a 5 gallon batch, that would be the C sample, or the 2 mils per gallon. But again, if you're doing a 10 gallon batch, it'd be 1 mil per gallon, and that would be the B. But I would recommend if people really want to do it, that I think the 10 mils, the new packaging, 10 mils in 1 5 gallon batch would probably be ideal.
And that takes it down to the almost undetectable level?
Yeah, it's pretty much it's below the limit of quantification. So we can say that when we do the test, we can sometimes see a little bit of blip, that there might be a little bit something there, but it's so low that we can't quantify it.
Slightly unrelated question, or a sidebar question. Are there any applications in other food processes or other foods that Clarity Ferm might be used for? So not in the beer industry, but I don't know where, but, baking somehow, other wheat products. Have you heard of anything?
I've heard people talk about it, but I don't know of anyone who's actually been able to use it on the other food product. It would certainly be ideal to be able to say, oh, well, here's this food that would have contained trace levels of gluten. We got this enzyme; it takes care of it. I think, you couldn't necessarily use this in bread, because in bread you need the gluten for the texture, and you'd have to have so much enzyme that you just have mush left over, not bread. So, but certainly I know that people are researching ways using similar types of things to make other types of foods gluten-free.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't mean to go down a rabbit hole. It just popped into my head, and there you go.
That's a good question. Well, very nice. I think that's very interesting. I mean, if there was any, you would think that adding an enzyme that works on, proteins or glutens would diminish the head retention, but it seems like it's having the opposite effect.
Yeah, that's surprising to me, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I can't explain other than potentially, again, it's breaking down proteins, but possibly some of the proteins that are left are the ones that contribute more to head retention, and so you're kind of increasing the percentage of those proteins, and so that's why you see that happening. That's my best guess. Interesting.
All right. Well, shall we clear the palettes and clear the plates and go on to round two? This is a bit tougher. These are stouts, and Chris has given us a blind tasting this time. We don't know what's what, so this is going to be more fun, and it's fun because they're real close again.
Boy, I'll say I can just say that these are so darn close that, I mean, there's just very, very little difference. I don't have any brilliant thing to say. It's the same beer to me. If I had to say something, I would make some kind of crazy guess and say, this one's got Clarity Ferm in it and this one doesn't. But it's awful darn close.
So yeah, I'm in the same boat. I find them all to be almost identical. One seemed to have a little less head retention than the others, and based on our previous round, I'm going to assume that's the control, but that's just a guess. They almost taste identical.
They're good. We can say that. We haven't said that already, but it's a good beer. And I, at one point, there are 4 samples, A, B, C, D. At one point, I thought that D had more substantial mouthfeel than the rest, and then I continued tasting, and I talked myself out of that. So, so I don't know. Maybe, if anything, at one point in the tasting, I felt that D had a more substantial mouthfeel. So that's the only difference. They tasted the same. They obviously looked the same because they're very dark. There doesn't seem to be the difference in head retention that we were seeing, head production and head retention that we saw in the previous batch. But other than that, boy, they're all good, and I would drink any of them. So pull back the curtain there, Chris.
All right. So the first 2 beers you had, that was the one-step mash with the single infusion. The A was the control, and the B was the Clarity Ferm of that. And then the C and the D's, those were the 3-step mashes. And the first one was the control, and the last one was the Clarity Ferm.
Interesting.
So now my thought with mentioning the head retention there on the last one was that because we did the protein rest in the mash, that potentially we're breaking down some of those proteins that might actually contribute to that, because it's certainly not noticeable when we did the single infusion mash and the B sample. So, but again, without more experimentation, that's a guess. So I guess I'll have to brew some more beer to figure that one out.
Oh, the things we do for science. You did mention one thing off mic about Clarity Ferm and its impact on bitterness.
Yeah, it was an unexpected finding, and certainly we'll have to repeat that. But we analyzed all the beers that we brewed for the IBUs using the normal methods with isooctane. And what we found was consistently the beers with the Clarity Ferm were about 2.5 to 3 IBUs higher, which we weren't really expecting. We thought they'd all show up the same. But the thought that we had, our hypothesis, is that because Clarity Ferm works by breaking down proteins, that potentially the normal beer without the Clarity Ferm, when those proteins come out of solution with the polyphenols, that the hop isoalpha acids are attracted to those, and so when they settle out at the bottom of the beer or even in the fermenter, that you're losing those in the fermenter, so that when you bottle it, they're gone. So potentially things to explore, or maybe ways that, if it is a real phenomenon in big breweries that really want those hoppy beers, it's one more technique they could use to punch it up.
To push just a few more IBUs out of the beer. But 2 or 3 IBUs is probably not within the range of human perception.
Right. It's really, I think you need to get different people have different numbers, but really I don't think you need to push it more than 3 for it to really be perceptible. No one that's tasted the beers has commented on any difference in bitterness. So certainly to the human palate, unless you're highly trained, I don't think you can pick up a 3 IBU difference.
So again, with this experiment, the beers that were treated with Clarity Ferm fall within the range of the barely perceptible as far as gluten is concerned.
They're all the beers that we brewed. So both of these beers with the Clarity Ferm, and we've done these multiple times. We actually did these. We checked them over a time period, and they're all below the 5 parts per million limited detectability. And again, we've repeated them multiple times. So sometimes they show up as 0. Other times they show up as having a little something there, but less than 5. So definitely less than 4 times below the FDA recommended limit. So
this means something fairly big to people with problems, real problems with gluten.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I know several people that avoid beer now because they either sensitive to gluten or they're celiac. And this would be awesome. It'd be give them an opportunity to drink really great beer. And it doesn't taste any different than the beers that people that are not sensitive to it drink.
Mm-hmm. To me, I mean, we've talked to Desiree Knott over at High Gravity, and she is an actual, celiac, and she has physical reactions. I mean, she showed me on her arm, at one point where, she walked in the grain room and I guess got some grain on her arm, and then she actually had, a rash on her arm from the grain. So it's, it's a real thing. But she was experimenting with different non-traditional grains, gluten-free grains, trying to come up with a gluten-free recipe that she liked, and she was having a great deal of difficulty in doing that. So, if good beer lovers can just brew the beers that they like and then use a product like Clarity Ferm, then that to me sounds like the optimum solution.
Yeah, I think it's simple. It's not that expensive. It's $3-4 for a 5-gallon batch of beer. Again, I would always say, try it first. Try a little bit. If you really do have diagnosed celiac disease, can I guarantee it's going to not cause a reaction for everyone? No. But I think for probably a large majority of the people with celiac disease, this is a solution to those not so great tasting gluten-free beers.
Is there any downside besides the little bit of added cost per batch?
From what we've seen, I can't really think of any downsides. You're adding one more thing to your beer. I guess you be careful with sanitation. You don't, so, we make sure we spray the vials down with Star San before we add them. But I do trust White Labs to make sure that the enzymes are, sterile so that we don't have to worry about that. But, it is one more thing. And you're adding it at fermentation, so you're not worried about introducing oxygen at that point. Potentially, anecdotally, or at least some of the sensory stuff, says it might thin out the beer a little bit, make it a little bit more watery mouthfeel. I don't think, it's barely detectable to me. I can tell that it's there, but really, if your beer is just a hair more on that mouthfeel side, a little bit lower, it's a lot better than those sorghum tasting gluten-free beers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we just did a blind taste here between controls and with Clarity Ferm, and I picked the wrong one. Right. So,
and honestly, on the first sample, when we were testing to see what the recommended dose was and would increasing the dose change the beer, I felt like the beers that were most affected were the ones that were of a higher than recommended dose. And so it sounds to me like if you use the recommended dose, you probably are going to get a beer that's equal to the beer you were and has no perceivable difference really in body.
Yeah. So wow, I mean, what's the next experiment, or what's the next phase?
So we're brewing up a wheat beer, a clone, an Oberon clone actually, and so we've looked at the preliminary on that, and because it has wheat, it has much higher levels of the gluten in there, and so we're interested. Is the same recommended dose of the Clarity Ferm going to work? We know from looking at the beer compared to the cream ale, it's 6 or 7 times more gluten in that beer, and compared to the stout too, it's 4 or 5 times higher, just because of all the wheat that goes in that beer. So that's one that's ongoing right now, and we'll be wrapping up by this fall. But yeah, beyond that, there's a lot of different things we can test, and so I like to let my students help me come up with ideas, because that way I can write up a research proposal and hopefully get some funding for that.
And we'd be glad to help you publish your findings.
That sounds great.
No, seriously. I mean, I'm really interested in hearing the effect on the wheat beers and anything else that you do as well. This is a well done experiment, at least from what we can see, and the beers taste good, and it's just fun to do this kind of stuff, and I feel honored and privileged that you brought it to us.
Well, thanks. It was, I've listened to your show for a while and always enjoyed it and some of the humor. And
not all of it.
And I did say some. It worked. It was great that it worked out here with the National Homebrew Convention to do this, and I wanted, again, sharing it with other people and, letting them know, as part of science is sharing it with other people, and part of, homebrew is sharing as well. So combining my, interests, again, it's a great thing.
Awesome. Well, Chris Hamilton, that was all the way back in June, and here we are, the 1st of September, basically.
Yep.
How time has flown.
Yeah, it's been a fast summer.
And you've had time to do another leg of the experiment. Before we get into that, I want to give shout-outs to those who have helped you.
Yeah, so all this work I did with students that I work with at Hillsdale College. And so the first student who did the cream ale experiments with me was Caitlin Bassett. And the more recent experiments with the stout and the wheat beer was Matt Dragowski.
So cheers to those hardworking students who make you look good, and and make us look good as well, because it was an incredible tasting in the hotel room. And you have moved on to a style which arguably could be more challenging to the Clarity Ferm experiment, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's really why we wanted to do it. Being a wheat beer, American wheat, it's going to have a lot more gluten in the beer. We weren't sure how effective the Clarity Ferm was going to be. I looked at the initial results, parts per million of the gluten. The cream ale started out about 30 to 40. The stout started out about 50 to 60 parts per million. And then this one started out at probably over 300 parts per million.
Wow.
So significantly more. And
and one would argue that, that adds to the character of the beer.
Right.
You expect that probably adds to the mouthfeel of the beer, which is what you expect with a wheat beer.
Right. Yeah, we were definitely more concerned with the flavor, the mouthfeel, the foam with this beer. So we made sure that when we did our tastings that we really took careful observations of everything. It was definitely kind of experiment we were building up to. And so this was kind of like, if this works, then it should probably work. Clarity Ferm should work with almost anything.
So we don't have the luxury of having beers, or I don't have the luxury of having beers in front of me to do the tasting myself. So how do you want to proceed? Do you want to talk about the numbers first, or do you want to talk about the sensory perceptions first?
Well, why don't I tell you, I'll just give you the basic recipe, and then we can talk a little bit about the numbers, and then kind of go into the tasting, because that's a bit more subjective, if that works for you.
Okay.
So the beer that we brewed, the American wheat, was a clone of Bell's Oberon. Anybody who's in Michigan or in Bell's territory knows that in most of the country, beginning of spring, Oberon comes out. It's huge in Michigan. And so the beer we brewed, it's almost 50-50 two-row and white wheat, so malted wheat, with just a little bit of caramel, Crystal 10, and just a hint of melanoidin. And the beer is kind of characterized as being slightly spicy, hoppy, and they use their proprietary yeast for it. So, unless you use that, you can't get it exactly right. But so it's a pretty simple recipe, but again, almost 50% wheat.
And did you say what yeast you used?
We ended up using the American Ale 2 yeast from Y Yeast, so the 1272, which is a little fruitier than the normal, the 1056, the American Ale 1 yeast. Mm-hmm. So we went with that. And we had read online other people had some success with that. With this beer, the brewing, we did it just like the stout. We did two different sets of mash conditions. We did the normal kind of single infusion mash where we batch sparged, and then we did one where we did several rests just by adding boiling water. So we did a protein rest at a lower temperature in the high, I think it was like 118-ish, and then we raised it to the beta rest, and then finally to do an alpha rest. And what we noticed with the stout before is that really didn't have too much of an effect on the protein, the gluten in the beer. But we figure with the wheat, there's so much more gluten that it might have a more significant effect.
And did the numbers bear that out?
So the numbers at the beginning, what we did notice is when we first analyzed the beers, after brewing them, what ended up happening was that we really couldn't distinguish that well between them because compared to our controls, the gluten was really off the charts in the beer. The maximum standard is 270 parts per million, and we were above that. The one we were kind of able to extrapolate to about 340, but we can definitely say both beers had more than the 270 parts per million. What we did is we actually monitored the gluten parts per million every day for a week during fermentation. And so the drop off there, it does look like, and it's a bit mixed, so it's a little hard to tell, but it does look like doing the protein rest did help a little bit, but in the end, it didn't really matter, at least for the gluten content.
So the numbers, so the gluten numbers were almost literally off the charts? Yeah,
they were really so they were above the maximum standard that we have with this ELISA kit that we use to do the analysis. We can get a reading, an absorbance number, but it's so far off the charts that we can't accurately say what the number is, other than it's definitely more than 270. And in the one case, it looks like was a lot more. So I'd be pretty comfortable saying that it's going to be over 300 parts per million. But is it 340? Is it 500? I can't distinguish between those two.
Wow. So that makes your job a little tougher.
Yeah, but fortunately, since we were analyzing it, every day, we could definitely see the numbers come down and drop. So we knew that, we didn't know exactly how high the numbers were starting at, but we could definitely tell that within 2 days of fermentation, we saw a noticeable drop. And then really, within and then it kind of just leveled out with the control beers that weren't treated. So the control beers kind of ended up finishing around 200, slightly above 200 parts per million. Actually, one of them did read a little high, but the one read about 290 at the end because we had 4 different controls in this case. 2 that had the kind of 3-step mash and 1 that was the single infusion. So around 200 when those finished. Now, then we treated them with the Clarity Ferm, and we actually, this time, we used 2 different concentrations of the Clarity Ferm. We were worried with the wheat. The recommended dosage, if you remember from those Clarity Ferm vials, is 10 mil vial for a 5-gallon batch of beer. So what we did is we figured, okay, we'll add 2 mils to 1 gallon, since that's the same ratio. But then we're like, since this is wheat, it's a really high concentration, let's also try adding 4 mils to 1 gallon to see if, we might need that little extra oomph to get the gluten degraded. Mm-hmm. And what we noticed is really, in the end, they both worked. The 2 mils did, at the end, there was no detectable gluten in our results, which means that it had, I think the bottom limit of detectability is somewhere around 2 parts per million. So none of our beers showed any detectable gluten at the end after bottling.
Wow.
So that was pretty exciting. If we go back and look at the timeline, between the 2 mils and the 4 mils, the 4 mils does look to drop off just a little bit sooner over time. So hypothetically, if you really wanted to brew the equivalent of a gluten-free wheat beer, and you needed to do it in 2 weeks, then I would say double up your Clarity Ferm. But other than that, certainly with the normal timeline of, a couple of weeks in the fermenter, a couple of weeks in the bottle, there's no detectable gluten.
Wow.
So
that's exciting news for celiacs out there. But the question is, can you tell a difference? What was the impact on the sensory side of things?
So on the sensory side of things, what we had is we ended up having 4 tasters who had some training in sensory evaluation. They may not be certified BJCP judges, but they're familiar with the score sheets and know how they work. And then we had another group of people that weren't really familiar with all of that and just, liked beer, and kind of had them do some tasting as well. And so let me make sure I pull up the exact numbers. So what we did we had like 8 to 10 people. We had kind of 2 different, what we call triangle tests. People are familiar with it. You have 2 beers that are the same and 1 beer that is different. And so we had 2 different triangles. And so these were people that weren't that familiar with sensory evaluation. We just said, taste these beers, write down some comments, and pick which beer is different. So could they pick out the Clarity Ferm beer? And what we found in that one was that when they tested the beer that had the kind of 3-step mash, about half the people could pick out the Clarity Ferm treated beer. When we did the beer with just the single infusion mash, only a third of the people were able to pick it up. And, basically that's 1 out of 3 by random guessing. You'd expect about that number to get it right. So it was pretty interesting that, again, it's a small sample to draw conclusions from, but it seemed like really, at least with that one, people really couldn't pick the beer out. So to them, it tasted the same as the others.
Huh. Just from the small sample, if you want to brew a gluten-free wheat beer, do a single-step infusion mash and use Clarity Ferm to knock out the gluten.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a small sample, but based on our tasters and our results, that definitely seems to be the way to go.
Of those that could tell the difference, what magnitude of difference or what degree of difference between the samples do they detect? It really varied on the person. I think, and again, I don't know if this was because of the Clarity Ferm or just the recipe, but and the finish, I think the beers had a high level carbonation, which is somewhat typical for American wheats. And I think some people were able to kind of pick up on almost a little bit more like carbonic bite from those beers. And I'm not exactly sure if that's maybe because we're breaking down proteins, the yeast have a little more, nutrients that they can use. And so maybe it's not even related to the gluten per se, but it's a side effect of the Clarity Ferm. But that's really more of a hypothesis that we'd have to kind of test out. Now the people that actually filled out like the score sheets, what was really interesting that we found though is that we had the people fill out scores, and then they ranked the beers, 1 through 6, because we had again the 2 different mash techniques, and then we had the control, the 2 mils of the Clarity Ferm per gallon, and the 4 mils of Clarity Ferm per gallon. And of all the tasters, all the tasters picked one of the 2 mil samples, at least one of the 2 mil samples in their top 2, and 2 of them picked both the 2 mil treated samples in their top 2. Wow!
So it was really interesting that the 2 mil Clarity Ferm beers, 2 mils per gallon, did by far the best. And really, what was surprising is there wasn't really a major perceptive difference in the mouthfeel or the foam, which were the 2 things we were most concerned about. Some people did mention it, but again, I think because of the high level of carbonation that was in the beer, it may have masked any sort of thinness in the beer due to it. But there really wasn't any perceptible thinness that people picked up on the beer. And at least flavor-wise, people really liked the 2 mil one better. When I had some of this early before we did the tasting, and my student Matt did as well, we kind of picked up that the Clarity Ferm treated beers seem to at least have a slightly hoppier flavor. But that kind of faded within, a couple weeks before we did the big group testing. And why that is, I don't know. Potentially, the thought kind of going back, if you recall when we did the tasting before, we did the IBU testing on the beers under the Clarity Ferm ones, tested slightly higher, a couple IBUs higher. Thought was, well, maybe because the Clarity Ferm is breaking down the gluten, you don't have these polyphenols that are pulling down some of the hop particles in the beer, so that with the Clarity Ferm, you might actually be getting a little bit more hop residue, at least initially. But, if you have a longer bottle conditioning, just like any hoppy beer that, we may have brewed, if you don't drink it within the first 3 to 4 weeks of bottling, the hop flavor really starts to diminish. And so we think that might be the same thing here.
Right. Well, this is exciting. I mean, if is this the answer? I mean, maybe it's been so long since we recorded in the hotel room that I forget what we said. But if this works even with a wheat beer,
right?
Is this the answer to those who are celiacs out there? Can they have their beer back?
I mean, I would say, again, I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't say that definitively for everyone that has celiac disease, but I can definitely say that I think most people that have celiac disease would probably be fine drinking this beer treated with Clarity Ferm. Again, you should have, doctor's recommendation and things like that. But the FDA recently, kind of formalized their approval that, any food products that are treated or processed to remove gluten and have less than 20 parts per million can be marketed as gluten-free. So if this, if you could sell the homebrew, which again, we know you can't, but if you could, we could sell the homebrew as being gluten-free.
Wow. So this, I mean, I don't know if anybody in the commercial world uses Clarity Ferm, but this could be an opportunity.
Yeah, I know there's one brewery that does it, and they call their beer Omission, but I'm sure I would wager that there are more making plans to do similar things. And clearly, the analysis, as long as you have a lab or can pay someone to do it for you, even White Labs has recently started doing the gluten analysis in beers for people. They definitely see it as a market and something that people may get into. But certainly for home brewers, if you have celiac disease or you have friends or family that do, this certainly looks like a really good option.
Wow. Well, this is groundbreaking stuff. I mean, this is real science applied to this problem, and you seem to have, if not discovered an answer, you have illuminated an answer. So
yeah, you've definitely kind of confirmed what people have kind of been saying, maybe going back and forth, and definitely shown that it's really working. White Labs, marketing this as saying that this will reduce gluten in beer. It really does reduce the gluten in the beer to levels that, we can't even detect in most cases. So even when we start off with huge levels of gluten. So, it's potentially really good news. We've had some people, again, just a handful of people we know that actually have been diagnosed with celiac disease, taste it, and they haven't had any issues. There's people now, too, that just have diets where they want to, remove gluten from their diet even though they aren't intolerant. And a number of them have decided that, this treated beer is fine for them to drink. So, whether or not there really are health benefits from removing gluten from your diet, I don't know. But if you want to try one of these, paleo diets or gluten-free diets, and remove it, Clarity Ferm definitely seems like the way to go, and not give up your beer.
Awesome. Well, Chris, I can't thank you enough. And again, say your students' names.
Matt Dragowski did the stout and the wheat beer, and Caitlin Bassett did the work on the cream ale.
Matt and Caitlin, thank you very, very much. And I'll be interested to hear from people with celiac disease who try this and we shall move forward. We're collecting data from the real world.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Chris.
Oh, you're very welcome. Happy to do it.
Well, thanks again to Chris for sharing the results. Again, I'm not kidding when I say I'm honored that he would choose us as the vehicle to publish the results of this. Very important stuff if you're a celiac or gluten intolerant. Also, be sure to check out Chris's write-up on beerandwinejournal.com, where his results will appear as a series of articles this week. And of course, thanks to Steve and to Andy. Andy, by the way, is founder of thehomebrewery.com. That's thehomebrewery.com, our local homebrew shop here in Northwest Arkansas. Thanks to those guys for their help and moral support as well. And while I'm at it, thanks again to everybody, all the people we talked to in Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo. Our listeners are what make this show what it is, and there's no more proof that you need than to listen to all 8 episodes and watch both video episodes that we shot up there. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. You'll find our bottle openers on our shop. Our Basic Brewing growler bags are available as well. Protect your precious homebrew and craft beer as you take it from place to place. Check out our support link where you can throw a couple of bucks into the tip jar by subscribing financially to our podcasts. Be sure to check out our DVDs, Extract Brewing and Partial Mashing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. You can find them all on our site. We've got combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time, with a free bottle opener included with any of our DVD combos for a limited time. And you can check out our Basic Brewing shirts in the store, too. Our brewers' logbooks are in the store. Keep track of up to 50 batches of beer. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online in our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Retire to an RV, the roadmap to affordable retirement, and Hobby Power Tall Landing Gear for DJI Phantom 1-2 Vision Quadcopter Wide and High Extend. Thanks again. Sometimes those descriptions are not so descriptive. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We greatly appreciate your support. And don't forget, you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the associate links on basicbrewing.com. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.